February 14, 1943, southern Tunisia. The Panzer IV commander feels the vibration before he hears it a dull thump from somewhere in the olive groves 200 meters ahead. His crew is buttoned up tight, turret traversing slowly across the ridgeline where American infantry scattered moments before. The engine idles. Dust hangs in the afternoon heat dots, then the world inverts. A finger of white fire punctures the hole just below the turret ring. No explosion, no shrapnel, just a jet of molten copper moving at 7,000 meters per second, vaporizing steel plate like wax. The interior floods with superheated gas. The loader's scream lasts less than a second. The driver convulses against his controls. The commander smells his own skin burning before the ammunition cooks off. Outside, a 19-year-old private from Ohio lowers a 5-foot steel tube from his shoulder. Smoke curls from the rear venturi. His loader is already slapping another rocket into the breech. The Panzer IV burns. This is not supposed to be possible. German armor has ruled Europe for 3 years, but in the hands of American infantry, a weapon weighing just 13 pounds has rewritten the rules of armored warfare. This is the story of the Bazooka and the moment tank crews learned to be afraid. In the autumn of 1939, the world watched Poland collapse in 18 days. German panzer divisions didn't just break through defensive lines, they erased them. Tanks moved faster than retreating armies could regroup. Infantry armed with rifles and grenades stood helpless as armor rolled past, encircled them, crushed supply lines, and dictated the tempo of entire campaigns. France fell the same way in 1940, 6 weeks. The Maginot Line bypassed. British and French anti-tank guns, mostly 25mm and 37mm pieces, proved marginally effective against early Panzer IEs and IIEs, but required crews to stand exposed, often dying before firing a second round. Infantry had almost nothing. Boys' anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails, desperation. The lesson was clear. Modern war belonged to the tank, and the American military, watching from across the Atlantic, understood it was catastrophically unprepared. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its infantry faced a terrifying problem. Standard issue weapons, the M1 Garand, the Browning automatic rifle, even the .50 caliber machine gun were useless against armor. The 37mm anti-tank gun, towed by truck or jeep, could penetrate early German tanks at close range, but it was slow to position, visible from half a mile away, and required a crew of 5. In fast-moving engagements, it arrived too late or died too quickly. German Panzer IIs mounted 50mm guns and frontal armor up to 70mm thick. By 1942, the Panzer IV, upgraded throughout the war, carried a long-barreled 75mm cannon and sloped armor that deflected all but the heaviest Allied shells. American infantrymen in North Africa, where the first major U.S. ground engagements began in late 1942, had no portable weapon that could stop them, but a solution was already in development, born not from military tradition, but from a physicist's curiosity and the desperate need for innovation. The concept dated back to 1938, when Swiss scientist Henry Mohaupt demonstrated the shaped charge effect to U.S. Army officials. The principle was elegant: a hollow cone of metal, lined with copper and backed by high explosive, would upon detonation collapse inward and form a superplastic jet capable of burning through steel armor. The phenomenon, known as the Monroe effect, had been observed since the 1880s, but never weaponized effectively. By 1942, American engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground had married this shaped charge warhead to a rocket motor and the launch tube simple enough for 2 men to operate. The weapon required no recoil mechanism. The rocket's propellant expelled rearward as it left the tube, balancing thrust. A soldier could fire it from the shoulder, reload in seconds, and move immediately. No trails to dig in, no gun crew to expose. They called it the rocket launcher, M1. Soldiers called it the bazooka, after a crude musical instrument used by radio comedian Bob Burns. The name stuck. By October 1942, the first production models reached US troops training for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Most had never seen one. Training manuals were incomplete. Doctrine didn't exist yet. The weapon was so new that even battalion commanders weren't sure how to deploy it. But in less than 4 months, it would prove itself in blood and fire, and German tank crews would learn what it felt like to be hunted. Operation Torch began on November 8, 1942. American forces landed at 3 points across French North Africa: Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Resistance from Vichy French forces was sporadic, sometimes fierce, but brief. Within 3 days, the landings succeeded. The real test came afterward, when US troops pushed east into Tunisia and met German armor for the first time. The Afrika Korps, battered but unbroken after months of fighting, the British 8th Army redeployed westward. Rommel's panzer divisions were experienced, aggressive, and equipped with tanks that outclassed nearly everything the Allies fielded in 1942. The Panzer III AUSF carried 50 mm frontal armor and a high-velocity 50 mm gun. The Panzer IV AUSF mounted a long 75 mm cannon capable of killing a Sherman at 1,500 meters. Against these, American M3 Grants and early M4 Shermans struggled at range, but the Bazooka wasn't designed for tank versus tank duels. It was built for the infantryman, the rifleman crouched in a ditch, the squad pinned in a village, the man who had no artillery support and no tank of his own. For him, the M1 Bazooka represented something revolutionary, the ability to fight back. The weapon itself was deceptively simple. A smoothbore steel tube, 54 inches long, weighing 13 pounds. The rocket, officially the M6A1, measured 21 inches and weighed 3.5 pounds. Its warhead contained 8 ounces of pentolite explosive shaped into a conical cavity lined with copper. Upon impact, the explosive detonated, collapsing the copper liner into a jet of molten metal that could punch through up to 3 inches of armor plate. Effective range was listed as 300 yards. Realistic combat range was closer to 150. Beyond that, accuracy deteriorated rapidly. The rocket had no fins in flight. It stabilized by spinning, imparted by angled vents in the motor tube. Wind, rain, or even the gunner's breathing could push the round off target. But at close range, in the right hands, it was devastatingly effective. Each Bazooka team consisted of 2 men, a gunner and a loader. The gunner carried the tube, aimed through a simple iron sight, and squeezed an electrical trigger wired to a battery pack. The loader carried the rockets, usually 3 to 6 rounds in a canvas satchel, and was responsible for arming each round by pulling a safety pin before insertion. Coordination was critical. A misloaded rocket could detonate prematurely. A poorly aimed shot wasted ammunition that couldn't be replaced in the field. Initial training in the States was rushed. Most infantry units received only a few hours of instruction before deployment. Live fire exercises were limited, rockets were expensive, and production was still ramping up. Many soldiers first fired the weapon in combat, learning its quirks under fire. The startling backblast that kicked up dust and revealed their position, the electric snap of the ignition, the way the rocket wobbled slightly before stabilizing downrange. German intelligence initially dismissed the weapon. Early reports from Tunisia in late 1942 mentioned a type of rifle grenade used by American infantry. Panzer commanders, accustomed to facing British 2-pounder guns and Soviet anti-tank rifles, didn't consider infantry a serious threat at range. Tanks advanced boldly, relying on speed and firepower to suppress resistance before it organized. That confidence began to crack in early 1943. American forces, blooded at Kasserine Pass in February, adapted quickly. Infantry units learned to set ambushes in terrain where tanks lost their mobility advantage. Rocky defiles, narrow village streets, olive groves with limited sightlines. Bazooka teams hid in ditches and behind stone walls, waiting until German armor closed to within 100 meters before firing. The first shot often missed, the second rarely did, and when a bazooka round struck home, the effect was unlike anything German crews had experienced. No ricochet, no external explosion, just a small hole in the hull and everyone inside dead or dying within seconds. The shaped charged jet didn't rely on kinetic energy like traditional armor-piercing shells. It didn't need velocity or mass. It simply burned through steel, then continued into the crew compartment as a spray of molten copper and superheated gas, igniting ammunition, fuel, hydraulic fluid, flesh. For the first time in the war, German tankers' men who had rolled across Europe with near impurity felt genuinely vulnerable, and the Americans had only just begun to understand what they were holding. Private First Class Eddie Miller crouched behind a low stone wall outside Gafsa, Tunisia, in March 1943. His loader, a farm kid from Nebraska named Kowalski, knelt beside him with 3 rockets laid out on a poncho. They'd been a team for 6 weeks. Miller had fired the bazooka exactly twice in training, once in combat. Kowalski had never seen a German tank until 4 days ago. The Panzer III emerged from the dust 200 yards out, turret scanning. Miller's hands were shaking, the tube rested on his shoulder, the crude iron sight wobbling as he tried to center it on the glacis plate. Kowalski whispered the range. 150. Wait. The tank rolled closer. 100 yards. Kowalski slid the rocket into the rear of the tube, pulled the pin, tapped Miller's helmet twice. Miller exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The electrical contact sparked. The rocket motor ignited with a sharp crack. The backblast kicked just 20 feet behind them, momentarily blinding Kowalski. The rocket left the tube at 280 feet per second, wobbling slightly, then steadied. Impact. A puff of smoke on the turret face. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the hatch flew open, and black smoke poured out. Miller didn't feel triumph. He felt sick. Kowalski was already loading another round, scanning for targets, his face blank with adrenaline. This was what they did now. This was what they'd been trained for in 3 hurried afternoons before shipping overseas. To men, 13 pounds of steel tube, and the ability to kill a 30-ton machine. Bazooka teams operated on trust and timing. The gunner was exposed while aiming standing, kneeling, or bracing against cover, but always visible. The loader had to move fast, handle explosive warheads under fire, and watch for threats the gunner couldn't see. Many teams developed rituals, hand signals, specific phrases, a rhythm that kept them alive when everything around them was chaos. They also carried the knowledge that firing gave away their position instantly. The backblast signature was impossible to hide. A cone of flame and dust erupting 15 feet behind the shooter. German infantry learned to watch for it. Machine gunners trained to suppress suspected bazooka positions immediately. Tank commanders, once they understood the threat, began flanking suspected ambush sites with infantry screens. But the weapon gave American soldiers something they hadn't had before: agency. They were no longer helpless against armor. A rifle squad with 1 bazooka could hold a roadblock, cover a withdrawal, or disable a tank supporting an enemy assault. It didn't matter if the Panzer outweighed them by 15 tons. At close range, courage and a 3-pound rocket equalized the fight. The genius of the bazooka wasn't in its launcher. It was in what happened in the microseconds after impact. Traditional armor-piercing shells relied on mass and velocity. A solid steel penetrator, fired at high speed, punched through armor plate by sheer kinetic force. Effectiveness depended on the angle of impact, the thickness of the armor, and the velocity of the round. Against sloped armor, or at long range, even heavy anti-tank guns often failed to penetrate. The bazooka's shaped charge warhead bypassed all of that. Upon impact, a piezoelectric fuse at the nose of the rocket triggered the main explosive charge. The detonation wave traveled through the pentolite explosive at approximately 23,000 feet per second, collapsing the hollow copper cone lining inward. The physics were brutal and elegant. The copper didn't melt in the conventional sense. It was compressed into a superplastic state. forming a jet moving at velocities exceeding 22,000 feet per second. This jet, no thicker than a pencil, struck the armor plate with pressures exceeding 3 million pounds per square inch. Steel, even hardened armor steel, behaved like a fluid under such forces. The jet didn't smash through, it bored through, vaporizing metal and creating a narrow perforation. Behind the initial jet came a slug of slower-moving copper, an explosive residue, widening the hole and spraying the interior with molten fragments. Inside the tank, the effect was catastrophic. The jet and secondary fragments ricocheted off interior surfaces, igniting ammunition propellant, puncturing fuel tanks, and killing or maiming crew members instantly. Even if the jet missed vital components, the overpressure alone could render a crew unconscious or cause fatal internal injuries. The shaped charge effect was largely independent of the delivery method's velocity. Unlike a kinetic penetrator, it didn't matter if the rocket was traveling at 300 feet per second or 3,000. The warhead's effectiveness came from the explosive shaping, not the speed of the projectile. This meant the Bazooka could be slow, inaccurate, and short-ranged and still lethal. German armor in 1943 had no effective defense. Applique plates could detonate the warhead prematurely, reducing penetration, but early war panzers lacked them. Sloped armor, which deflected kinetic rounds, did nothing against a shaped charge that detonated on contact regardless of angle. The only real defense was distance, keeping infantry outside effective range, or combined arms tactics that suppressed bazooka teams before they could fire. But in the close quarters fighting of Tunisia, Italy, and later Normandy's hedgerows, distance was a luxury German tank commanders rarely had. The bazooka rewrote infantry anti-armor tactics almost overnight, but doctrine took months to solidify. Early engagements in Tunisia were chaotic, improvisational. By mid-1943, patterns emerged, lessons written in burned-out tank hulls and dead crewmen. The ideal engagement range was 100 yards or less. Beyond 150 yards, accuracy dropped sharply. The rocket's slow velocity, around 280 feet per second, at launch meant a target at 300 yards had nearly a full second to react. Moving targets were almost impossible to hit at range. Stationary tanks, buttoned up and unaware, were the preferred prey. Infantry commanders learned to position bazooka teams in locations that funneled armor into kill zones. Narrow streets in Italian hill towns, sunken roads in the Norman bocage, defiles in North African wadis. Anywhere the tank lost maneuverability and couldn't easily reverse or traverse its turret. The standard tactic: hold fire until the tank committed to the approach. Let it roll past prepared rifle positions, then hit it from the side or rear, where armor was thinnest and engine compartments vulnerable. A single penetrating hit to the engine deck could immobilize a panzer, turning it into a stationary pillbox or a death trap. Infantry closed in with grenades and satchel charges. Urban combat proved particularly effective. In towns like Cassino, Ortona, and later Suntley, bazooka teams operated from second-story windows, firing down onto tank decks, where armor was often just 10 to 20 millimeters thick. The downward angle also minimized backblast danger to the team. Dust and flame vented into open air other than confined spaces, but the weapon had severe limitations. The backblast meant teams couldn't fire from enclosed rooms without risking injury or revealing their position through blown-out windows. Reloading took 8 to 12 seconds under ideal conditions, an eternity when a panzer's coaxial machine gun was stitching the wall above your head, and every shot was a gamble. Hit and survive, or miss and die. Weather compounded difficulties. Rain degraded the electrical firing system. Moisture could corrode battery contacts or short the wiring. Extreme cold made the pentolite explosive less reliable. Heat didn't affect the warhead much, but it exhausted the men carrying extra rockets across North African or Italian summer terrain. Still, the psychological effect on German armor was profound. Panzer crews began treating every hedgerow, every stone building, every pile of rubble as a potential ambush. Advance rate slowed. Tanks moved with infantry screens, sacrificing speed for security. Commanders who had once led from the front now buttoned up tight. Vision slits narrowed. Situational awareness reduced. The Americans had given their infantry teeth and German tankers learned to respect them. Lieutenant Hans Becker survived 3 Bazooka ambushes in Italy. He wrote in a March 1944 letter that the weapon makes ghosts of us. His crew had learned to recognize the signs. American infantry that didn't retreat when armor appeared. Villages that seemed abandoned but weren't. Roadways with suspiciously fresh rubble piles on either side. The first time, outside Anzio, a rocket struck his Panzer, the 4th's turret ring. The jet missed the crew compartment by centimeters, but severed hydraulic lines and jammed the traverse. They abandoned the tank under small arms fire. 3 men wounded, 1 dead. The second time, the rocket hit low, penetrating the hull and killing the driver instantly. Becker pulled his gunner and loader out through the turret hatch, while American riflemen fired from a farmhouse 60 meters away. The third time, he saw the flash the telltale backblast from a hedgerow and screamed for the driver to reverse. The rocket passed a meter in front of the glacis plate. They hosed the hedgerow with machine gun fire, backed into a tree line, and called for infantry support. The Bazooka team escaped. Becker's fear was widely shared. German after-action reports from Tunisia onward noted the weapon's demoralizing effect on tank personnel, unlike artillery or anti-tank guns, which announced their presence with muzzle flashes and sound. The Bazooka gave almost no warning. A soldier stood up, aimed, fired. By the time the crew saw the threat, the rocket was already in flight. Inside the tank, a Bazooka hit was uniquely terrifying. The penetration was instantaneous, no ricochets, no external spalling, just a sudden hole and a spray of molten copper. Men died without understanding what had killed them. Survivors described the interior lighting up white, the smell of burned meat and copper, the screams of crewmates trapped in their stations. German tankers began painting unit insignia on hull sides to identify disabled friendly vehicles and avoid driving into ambush sites. Some crews welded spare track links or concrete blocks onto hull fronts, hoping to trigger premature detonation. Others refused to advance without infantry reconnaissance, slowing operations and frustrating commanders who needed rapid armor exploitation. Rommel himself, in a February 1943 memo to Wehrmacht High Command, noted that American infantry possess a man-portable anti-armor weapon of considerable effectiveness. He recommended immediate development of countermeasures. Within months, German factories began producing shears and thin steel skirts mounted on panzer sides to detonate shaped charges prematurely, reducing penetration, but adaptation took time and production capacity lagged. Through most of 1943 and into 1944, German armor faced an enemy that could kill them from positions they couldn't see, at ranges where their superior guns and optics provided no advantage. For the first time in the war, the tank crew was the hunted, not the hunter. The M1 Bazooka that entered service in late 1942 was crude, but functional. Early models suffered from electrical firing failures, corroded battery contacts, and occasional rocket misfires. The two-piece tube design, connected by a latch coupling, sometimes separated under rough handling. Soldiers complained about the weight, the exposed wiring, and the lack of protective shields. By mid-1943, the improved M9 Bazooka reached frontline units. The barrel was lengthened slightly for better accuracy. The electrical system was redesigned with better insulation and moisture sealing. A blast deflector was added to protect the gunner's face. Most importantly, the two became a single rigid piece, eliminating the fragile coupling joint. Production ramped up dramatically. By the end of 1943, American factories were producing over 15,000 bazookas per month. Total wartime production exceeded 476,000 launchers and 15 million rockets. The weapon was issued not just to frontline infantry, but to airborne units, Marine Corps divisions, and even some rear echelon security troops. The simplicity of manufacture was a strategic asset. The launcher required no precision machining, just steel tubing, simple electrical components, and basic metalwork. Rockets could be mass-produced in converted automotive plants. This scalability ensured that supply kept pace with demand, even during the massive material expenditures of the Normandy and Italian campaigns. Other nations took notice. The British P-IAT projector, infantry, anti-tank used a spring-loaded spigot launcher rather than a rocket, but employed the same shaped charge warhead principle. The Soviet Union fielded the RPG-43 hand-thrown anti-tank grenade and later developed rocket-propelled variants. German forces captured bazookas in Tunisia and Italy, reverse engineering them into the Panzerschreck Raycartem Panzerbergs 54, an enlarged, more powerful version that terrified Allied tank crews in turn. The bazooka's influence extended far beyond World War II. Post-war, it became the template for generations of infantry anti-tank weapons. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka used in Korea, the Soviet RPG-27, and countless modern disposable rocket launchers. The principle remained unchanged: give the infantryman a weapon that could kill armor at close range, and you fundamentally alter the battlefield calculus. But in 1943 and 1944, for the men who carried it across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, the bazooka was not a historical artifact or a symbol of technological progress. It was a 13-pound tube that might save their lives or get them killed trying. The real test came not in isolated skirmishes, but in sustained operations where American infantry had to hold ground against determined German armor attacks. The pivotal moment arrived in the weeks following Kasserine Pasta, humiliating February 1943 defeat that exposed American tactical inexperience and caused over 6,000 casualties. Rommel's Afrika Korps had punched through U.S. lines with brutal efficiency, exploiting poor coordination and green leadership. American forces retreated in disorder, equipment was abandoned, morale cratered. But the withdrawal wasn't a rout, it was a reorientation. And when German armor tried to exploit their success in early March, they met a different kind of resistance. On March 17, 1943, elements of the 1st Infantry Division established defensive positions around the Gafsa sector in central Tunisia. Intelligence indicated German forces would attempt to retake Gafsa, a strategic road junction, with a combined arms push involving at least 2 panzer companies, supported by motorized infantry. The American position was thin under strength rifle companies spread across rocky terrain, with limited artillery support and no tank reserves. But every rifle platoon now had at least 1 bazooka team. Some had 2. The German attack began at dawn. 8 Panzer IIs and 5 Panzer IVs advanced in loose formation along the Gafsa road, their engines audible 3 kilometers out. Behind them, half-tracks carried Panzer Grenadier infantry. The plan was textbook: suppress American positions with tank fire, dismount infantry to clear strongpoints, roll through and secure the town. By midday, the 1st Panzer III crossed the American forward line at 0620 hours. No one fired. The tank continued, turret traversing, searching for targets. Behind it, 2 more panzers followed, maintaining interval. The formation looked confident, almost casual commanders standing in open hatches, scanning with binoculars. At 75 meters, Corporal James Hendricks, an Oklahoma native with 3 weeks combat experience, rose from a ditch and fired. The rocket struck the lead Panzer III below the turret, left side. The shaped charge jet penetrated the hull sponson and detonated stored machine gun ammunition. Secondary explosions blew the turret hatches open. The tank veered left, struck a boulder, and stopped. Smoke poured from every opening. Hendricks' loader was already reloading. The 2nd Panzer, attempting to reverse, threw a track on uneven ground. Another bazooka team, positioned 200 meters south, fired twice. 1 miss, 1 hit to the engine deck. The Panzer burned. The remaining German tanks halted, confused. American rifle fire erupted from positions that had seemed empty moments before. Mortar rounds began falling on the Panzer Grenadiers, still mounted in half-tracks. The lead Panzer IV commander, trying to identify the threat, exposed himself through the cupola hatch and took a sniper's bullet to the chest. By 0645, the German attack had stalled completely. 3 tanks destroyed, 1 immobilized, and infantry pinned down by interlocking fields of fire. The remaining panzers withdrew under smoke, dragging 2 disabled vehicles with them. American casualties: 4 wounded, none killed. The Bazooka teams had expended 11 rockets and achieved 5 hits. This was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. Over the next 6 weeks, similar engagements occurred across Tunisia. Near Maknassi on March 22nd, a single Bazooka team knocked out a Panzer Ives attempting to flank a roadblock, forcing an entire German column to withdraw. At Algeta on March 23rd, during a massive German counterattack involving 50 tanks, American infantry armed with bazookas and anti-tank mines destroyed or disabled 21 panzers in a single day. The German offensive, intended to roll back American gains, collapsed. The weapon's effectiveness wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. German commanders grew cautious. Tanks that had once advanced aggressively now moved tentatively, hull down when possible, reversing at the first sign of infantry resistance. The speed advantage that made blitzkrieg doctrine effective eroded when every advance risked ambush by invisible infantrymen with portable anti-armor weapons. By May 1943, when Axis forces in Tunisia finally surrendered, over 60,000 German and Italian troops were captured. Among the captured material, dozens of burned-out panzers, many bearing the distinctive small entry holes of bazooka penetrations. Post-battle assessments credited Bazooka teams with at least 30 confirmed tank kills during the final month of fighting, a significant percentage of total German armor losses in the theater. But Tunisia was just the beginning. The real proving ground came in Italy, where terrain and urban combat magnified the bazooka's advantages and exposed German armor 2 months of brutal attrition. The Italian campaign began in September 1943 with amphibious landings at Salerno. The terrain, mountainous, broken by river valleys and medieval hill towns, was a nightmare for armor and a paradise for infantry ambush. German forces, fighting a masterful defensive withdrawal up the peninsula, relied heavily on mobile panzer and assault gun units to plug breaches and counterattack Allied advances. They also learned, painfully, that Italian villages were death traps for tanks. Monte Cassino, January through May 1944, became a crucible. The town itself sat at the base of a mountain crowned by a medieval monastery, overlooking Route 6, the main Allied advance corridor toward Rome. German paratroopers and Panzer Grenadiers fortified every building. Streets barely wide enough for a single vehicle channeled armor into predictable approaches. Allied infantry, pushing house to house, carried bazookas as primary weapons. On February 15th, during the Second Battle for Cassino, a platoon from the 36th Infantry Division entered the town center under heavy fire. They advanced through rubble-choked alleys, clearing rooms with grenades and rifle fire. At the Piazza San Benedetto, they encountered a Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gunner low-profile, turretless tank destroyer, mounting a 75mm gun positioned to cover the main approach. The assault gun had already knocked out 2 Allied Shermans that morning. Infantry couldn't advance. Artillery couldn't get a clear shot without destroying the entire block. Sergeant Robert Dole, no relation to the future senator, volunteered his bazooka team. They crawled through a collapsed pharmacy, emerged in a second-story apartment overlooking the piazza, and fired from a blown-out window at a 45-degree downward angle. The rocket struck the assault gun's thin roof armor and penetrated into the crew compartment. The vehicle didn't explode, it simply stopped moving. Smoke seeped from the hatches. The crew never emerged. Similar engagements occurred daily. At Anzio, where Allied forces landed behind German lines in January 1944 and were immediately pinned. In a shallow beachhead, bazooka teams became the primary defense against German armor counterattacks. On February 16, during a major German offensive to push the Allies back into the sea, Bazooka-armed paratroopers from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment stopped 7 Panzer IVs in a single engagement near the flyover bridge. 3 tanks destroyed, 2 immobilized, the rest withdrew. The beachhead held, but the climax, the moment the Bazooka truly earned its reputation, came in Normandy, June 1944, in the hedgerows of the Bocage country. The Norman hedgerows were ancient earthen walls, 6 to 10 feet high, topped with dense thickets of brush and trees. They bordered every field, every lane, creating a patchwork of enclosed spaces with limited visibility and almost no maneuver room. For Allied armor, it was claustrophobic horror. For German defenders, it was ideal defensive terrain. For Bazooka teams, it was a hunting ground. On June 10th, 4 days after D-Day, the 2nd Armored Division pushed inland from Omaha Beach toward St. Lay. Progress was measured in meters. Every hedgerow concealed German infantry. Every intersection was covered by anti-tank guns or concealed panzers. Tanks advancing alone were picked off by Panzerforce German disposable anti-tank weapons, inspired by captured bazookas. But American infantry, working in close coordination with armor, turned the hedgerows against their defenders. The tactic: infantry advanced along hedgerows, while Shermans provided suppressing fire. When German armor appeared, bazooka teams hidden in the dense vegetation engaged from the flanks at ranges under 100 yards. The Germans couldn't see the threat until the rocket was already in flight, and in the confined spaces of the Bocage, there was nowhere to maneuver, no room to reverse quickly. On July 11th, during Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Normandy beachhead bazooka teams from the 29th Infantry Division engaged German armor attempting to block the Via St. Lay road. In a single afternoon, they knocked out 4 Panzer IVs and 2 Panther tanks. The Panthers, Germany's most advanced medium tanks with sloped armor up to 80 mm thick, were theoretically resistant to frontal bazooka hits. But flanking shots to the side hull and rear engine deck proved lethal. 1 Panther, hit in the engine compartment, burned for 6 hours. By the end of July, as Allied forces broke out into open country and the German defensive line collapsed, bazooka teams had accounted for an estimated 160 confirmed tank kills. In Normandy alone, nearly 15% of total German armor losses in the theater. The weapon that had entered service 18 months earlier as an experimental stopgap had become a foundational element of American infantry doctrine. German tank crews, already demoralized by Allied air superiority and overwhelming material strength, now feared their own infantry more than enemy tanks. Memoirs and interrogation reports from captured panzer personnel repeatedly mentioned the Rohrwaffe, the tube weapon, as a source of constant anxiety. Commanders who had once led armored spearheads through Poland and France now advanced cautiously, buttoned up tight, eyes scanning hedgerows for the telltale backblast that meant death. The bazooka had done more than kill tanks. It had stripped German armor of its psychological edge, the aura of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe. And in doing so, it had fundamentally altered the nature of armored warfare, proving that technology and courage could make even the smallest infantry unit a credible threat to steel giants. The German response to the bazooka threat was swift, pragmatic, and ultimately insufficient. By summer 1943, Wehrmacht engineers were already testing countermeasures. The simplest solution chosen, or armored skirts, appeared on Panzer Es and IVS by late 1943. These were thin steel plates, typically 5 to 8 mm thick, hung on brackets several inches away from the hull and turret sides. The theory was sound. A shaped charge warhead detonating against the skirt would form its penetrating jet prematurely, dissipating much of its energy before reaching the main armor. In practice, results were mixed. Scherzen reduced penetration effectiveness by roughly 30 to 40%, enough to save crews in some cases, but not enough to make panzers immune. A well-aimed bazooka, shot at close range, could still punch through skirt and hull armor, especially on older models, and the skirts themselves were flimsy, often torn off by brush, debris, or near-miss artillery blasts. More elaborate countermeasures followed. Zimaret paste, a hard, textured coating applied to hull and turret surfaces, was developed to prevent magnetic mines from adhering. Though primarily an anti-mine measure, it also created a standoff gap that slightly reduced shaped charge effectiveness. Application was labor-intensive and added production time, but by early 1944, most new German tanks rolled out of factories coated in the distinctive ridged pattern. German crews also adapted tactically. Panzer commanders began insisting on closer infantry coordination. Tanks no longer advanced alone into contested terrain. Panzer grenadiers screened approaches, suppressed suspected ambush sites, and cleared buildings before armor committed. This slowed advance rates dramatically, but reduced ambush casualties. Commanders learned to avoid predictable routes, to maneuver in irregular patterns, and to reverse immediately if they spotted backblast signatures. Some units adopted improvised armor sandbags, concrete blocks, spare track links welded to hull fronts. These additions degraded mobility and stressed suspensions, but desperate crews accepted the trade-offs. A slower, overloaded tank was better than a burning one, yet no amount of adaptation could fully negate the bazooka's impact. The weapon had fundamentally shifted the infantry armor dynamic. Before 1942, infantry-facing tanks had two choices: retreat or die. By 1944, they had a third: fight back. That psychological shift rippled through every level of ground combat. German tankers, once confident and aggressive, became cautious and defensive. Post-war interviews with captured panzer personnel in a consistent theme: fear of the unseen. Artillery you could hear, anti-tank guns you could spot. But the bazooka came from nowhere: a rifleman in a ditch, a soldier in a window, a shadow in a hedgerow. The uncertainty was corrosive. It made every advance feel like a gamble. American commanders, conversely, grew more confident. Infantry units that had once called for tank support to deal with German armor now handled threats independently. This freed up armored divisions for exploitation and pursuit rather than static defense. The operational flexibility gained by arming infantry with portable anti-tank weapons cannot be overstated. It allowed combined arms doctrine to function, even when tanks and infantry were separated by terrain or operational tempo. Allied forces weren't alone in recognizing the weapon's value. The Soviet Union, which had suffered catastrophic tank losses in 1941 and 1942, accelerated development of its own shaped charge weapons. The RPG-43 hand-thrown grenade entered service in 1943, followed by the RPG-6. Soviet infantry, already expert at close-quarters anti-tank combat using Molotov cocktails and satchel charges, embraced the new technology. By 1944, Soviet rifle divisions were fielding infantry anti-tank units armed with captured German Panzerschrecks, and later domestically produced rocket launchers. The British Piat, while mechanically different, filled the same doctrinal niche. Its spring-loaded spigot launcher was heavier and more cumbersome than the bazooka, but its shaped charge warhead was equally effective. British infantry in Italy and northwest Europe used PIATs extensively, particularly in urban combat, where short ranges negated the weapon's poor accuracy. Even the Germans, despite their industrial resource constraints, reverse-engineered captured bazookas into the Raketen-Panzerberg 54. The Panzerschreck, larger, heavier, and more powerful than its American counterpart, the Panzerschreck could penetrate up to 160 mm of armor. German Panzer Grenadiers and Volksgrenadier units used it to devastating effect against Allied Shermans and British Churchills in 1944 and 1945. The weapon that had once terrorized German tank crews now terrorized Allied ones. A grim symmetry. By war's end in May 1945, the bazooka had become ubiquitous. Over 15 million rockets had been produced. The weapon was standard issue, young lost in American infantry divisions, but in airborne units, Marine Corps Raider battalions, and even some Army Air Forces ground defense units. It had seen action in every major theater: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Germany, the Pacific Islands, Burma, and the Philippines. The statistical record tells part of the story. Estimates vary, but conservative figures credit Bazooka teams with at least 800 confirmed German tank and assault gun kills between 1943 and 1945. That number doesn't include armored cars, half-tracks, or fortified positions destroyed with the weapon, nor does it account for the deterrent effect, the attacks that never happened because German commanders feared bazooka ambushes. More significant than raw numbers was the doctrinal transformation. Pre-war military thinking viewed infantry as inherently vulnerable to armor. Tanks could break infantry lines, exploit breakthroughs, and dictate battlefield tempo. Anti-tank defense required specialized units, artillery battalions, tank destroyer formations, towed guns crewed by trained specialists. The infantry rifleman could only dig in and hope. The bazooka democratized anti-armor capability. Any rifle squad could now threaten tanks. This forced combined arms integration at the lowest tactical levels. Tank units couldn't operate independently. Infantry couldn't rely solely on supporting arms. The weapon created interdependence and, in doing so, made both branches more effective. Post-war analysis by U.S. Army historians identified the bazooka as one of the 5 most tactically significant weapons of the conflict, alongside the M1 Garand rifle, the proximity-fused artillery shell, the P-51 Mustang fighter, and radar-guided anti-aircraft systems. Its impact wasn't just measured in destroyed vehicles, but in altered behavior, German caution, Allied confidence, and the psychological recalibration of what infantry could achieve. The human cost, however, remained stark. Bazooka teams suffered disproportionately high casualties. Operating at close range meant exposure to tank machine guns, supporting infantry, and artillery. Many teams never survived their first engagement. Others fired once, killed a tank, and died moments later when German infantry responded. The weapon gave them a fighting chance, but it didn't make them invulnerable. Private Eddie Miller, the gunner from Tunisia, was killed near Anzio in March 1944. A Panzer IV he engaged from 80 meters, took the rocket to its turret face, but didn't brew up. The commander, wounded but conscious, traversed the coaxial machine gun and killed Miller and his loader before evacuating the damaged tank. Both men were 19 years old. Sergeant Robert Dole, who knocked out the assault gun at Casino, survived the war and returned to California. He never spoke publicly about his combat service. His grandson, researching family history decades later, found a single reference in the 36th Division's after-action report. Bazooka team eliminated enemy AFV armored fighting vehicle, Piazza San Benedetto, the 15th of February 44. Commendation recommended. No commendation was ever issued. The paperwork was lost. Corporal James Hendricks, credited with the first kill at Gafsa, survived Tunisia, Sicily, and Normandy. He was killed by a German sniper near Aachen in October 1944, 4 months after D-Day. His bazooka, still functional, was passed to another soldier and used until the war ended. These were the men who carried 13 pounds of steel tube into combat and made history with 3-pound rockets. Their names rarely appear in histories of the war, but their collective impact thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of engagements rewrote the rules of ground combat. The bazooka's legacy extended far beyond 1945. The weapon became the template for every infantry anti-tank system that followed. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka, used in Korea, delivered twice the punch. The Soviet RPG-7, introduced in 1961 and still in use today, directly descended from captured American and German rocket launchers studied after the war. Modern disposable systems AT-4S, LAWS, RPG-29s all employ the same basic principle. Give the infantryman a shoulder-fired shaped charge weapon that can kill armor, The concept proved equally effective in asymmetric conflicts. Insurgents in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria used RPGs and their variants to devastating effect against technologically superior forces. The Bazooka's lesson that portable anti-armor weapons fundamentally change the infantry-armor relationship remained as relevant in the 21st century as it was in 1943, but perhaps the most profound legacy was psychological. The Bazooka proved that technological superiority was temporary, that innovation could level playing fields, and that courage armed with the right tool could defeat mass and armor. For American industry, it demonstrated the value of pragmatic, rapidly deployable solutions over perfectionism. For soldiers, it restored agency in a war increasingly dominated by machines, and for German tankers who faced it, the bazooka remained a nightmare long after the war ended, the weapon that turned hunters into prey and taught steel giants to fear shadows. There is a photograph, rarely published, taken by a Signal Corps cameraman near St. Lay in late July 1944. It shows a discarded bazooka tube lying in the mud beside a Norman hedgerow. The electrical wiring is frayed. The metal is scratched and dented. Beside it, half buried, are 3 expended rocket casings. No one knows who carried it. No record exists of how many tanks it killed, or whether its crew survived the war. It is simply there, a piece of steel tubing in the mud, anonymous and unremarkable. Yet that single tube represents something profound. The moment warfare became personal again, even in an age of machines, the bazooka did not win World War II. Artillery, air power, industrial capacity, and the courage of millions decided the outcome. But the weapon changed what it meant to be infantry facing armor. It gave soldiers a choice where none had existed. It turned the hunted into hunters, and in doing so, it restored a measure of human agency to a conflict dominated by tonnage and horsepower. For German tankers, the bazooka was a reckoning. The invincibility they had enjoyed since 1939 was always an illusion, sustained by technological advantage and tactical surprise. When American infantry gained a weapon that could kill armor at close range, that illusion shattered. The psychological toll, constant vigilance, fear of unseen threats, the knowledge that every advance might be your last ground down, even veteran crews. For the Americans who carried it, the bazooka was both lifeline and burden. It saved lives. It also demanded them. Firing meant exposing yourself, trusting your loader, betting everything on a single shot. Many lost that bet, but the ones who survived knew they had fought back against steel and fire with nothing but a tube, a rocket, and courage. War has always been a contest between offense and defense, innovation and adaptation. The bazooka was a moment in that endless cycle, a weapon born of desperation, refined through combat, and ultimately countered by new armor and new tactics. But its influence endures in every modern infantry squad equipped with portable anti-tank weapons, in every military doctrine that assumes infantry can threaten armor, in every conflict where asymmetry is bridged by ingenuity. And perhaps most importantly, it endures in memory. The memory of young men who stood their ground when tanks rolled toward them, who shouldered steel tubes and fired rockets into the teeth of German armor, and who proved that even in the mechanized hell of World War II, the individual soldier still mattered. The bazooka didn't just melt armor in seconds, it melted certainty. And in war, that may be the most powerful weapon of all.